Can everyone hear me? Perfect. It is an especially wonderful delight today to be able to welcome our speaker, Dr. Kian Goh. Kian is my academic big sister. We have shared an office together, we have shared advisors together, we have shared publications together, and so it's a great pleasure to have her here today. Many of you are interested in a PhD. That's why you're in this research seminar. Not less than 3 out of my 6 office hours students this morning expressed an interest in pursuing a PhD. So as you listen to the remarkable story that Kian is going to tell you today, be thinking about how did she arrive at this incredibly insightful, productive line of research with the cases that she chose and the insights that she has developed. And the reason that as I describe her own life trajectory and the very embodied research that she has brought to the table here, that is the reason I also encourage so many of you to go on and work and experience and live. And then through that knowledge, be able to create new knowledge. You create knowledge by being out in the world, by seeing, by being. And I think that is what Kian has done. Kian is originally from Malaysia. And I think that's an important backdrop for the perspectives that she brings, being rooted in the geographies and the identities of Southeast Asia. She's also a queer woman of color, and so I think that that's an important part of always being a bit inside and always being a bit outside. She's trained as an architect. She got a master's in architecture from Yale. She's worked for I don't know my architecture firm, MVRDV in Rotterdam, as well as Weiss Manfredi. She designed early in her career part of the Museum of the Earth, which is just up by Taganrog Falls, and she designed a part of, is it the parking lot and some other parts of it?
I basically drew part of it. I think
she drew part, okay.
The design work came from others in the office. But
I
yeah,
see.
You should check it out. It's pretty cool if you haven't.
I have been there many times and taken pictures, and always say my friend helped design this place. So she worked and she has taught at many different places, and I think in the one of the things that she'll talk about also was doing this design work in Brooklyn for the Red Hook initiative, and the work that she's been in is she created her own firm called Super Interesting with an exclamation mark, all capital letters, and so alongside the kind of commercial high-end work that she has done for big name firms, she also started her own firm doing engaged, beneficial, socially embedded and just work, and taking the work and the skills that she has to the communities that may not otherwise be able to afford this kind of design thinking. So increasingly, I think she worked for a long time as an architect, but became increasingly interested in issues of social justice in politics, and the politics especially of design, and the power that designers bring to their work without ever really consciously thinking about the implications of what they draw, the beautiful things that they draw as they intersect with the real environment and people who live there. So she went on to pursue a degree at MIT in planning. I've just learned that she was also admitted to the Cornell program, and she came here last time in 2011, and then in a very monumentally influential choice, she decided to pursue her PhD at MIT. Who knows what would have happened had she stayed here, right? You could have her as a professor these days. She has taught at MIT, at UPenn, at Northeastern, the New School, Washington University in St. Louis, and now she is an assistant professor at UCLA. So her work, I think, the work she's coming to talk about today is Form and Flow, the Spatial Politics of Urban Resilience and Climate Justice. This is fresh off the presses, really, literally, and so it's I think, one of these books that I think will be read for years and years and taught for years and years, because it brings together such a new perspective that takes Castells and Harvey and Gandhi and Bulkley, and if they all had a baby together, it would be this incredible book that talks about the spatial justice of these places. And for those of you who are in the class that I'm teaching, you know, all the things that she's talking about, relationality between these cases, the politics of design, the importance of counter movements and counter plans, and seeing how these places the different stories, the different versions of plans and visions that could be, that we then help to actualize. There are so many different possibilities. Which ones will you go out there to find? Which ones will you go out there to elevate and to support is all seen, I think, here in her book. And so I'm so delighted to have her here and look forward to her talk. Kian is going to talk for about 40 minutes in a slight departure from our normal approach. We're going to then have a conversation, she and I, in the front for a little bit before we open it to Q&A with all of you, and I know you'll bring awesome questions like you do every session. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kian Goh.
Oh my God, Linda, thank you so much. That is like the best introduction I have ever gotten, and only you could have done that. Thank you. So as Linda says, y'all can hear me, right? There's a mic. As Linda says, we've known each other for quite a while. I actually credit Linda really for setting the stage for a lot of the ways that I think about climate when we were in MIT together. And really, I was just starting to think about these issues. Also, just so you all know, so who is a student of Professor Shah is here? So I'm just really happy for you. Like, I would love to be Linda's student, so awesome. And it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Cornell AAP. I don't come here enough, and it's great. And you know, just one thing, just before. My background is in architecture, and I consider it a particular, like a real moment to be giving a talk in a RAM building. Okay, for those of you who know an OMA building. And my 25-year-old self would be so impressed. My current self is mildly impressed. Okay, so before we get started, so here's what, here's a few things that I want to say first. So for those of us, before I actually like launch into it, so for those of us who are concerned about climate change, cities, and planning, some of the things that keep us up at night really are questions like, what is it about cities, or maybe more accurately, processes of urbanization that are particularly impacted by climate change, and what can we do about it? What can we change about those aspects of cities? That's one. How do we understand differences from one place to another? How do we compare them? Or, as I'll talk about, that's really relevant to my work, how do we understand how one place is related to another place? And then thirdly, how do we make sure that the impacts of climate change that are already unequal and unjust are not made worse by our responses to the impacts of climate change? So those are things that keep me up at night. They are a broad context for the things that I'm going to talk about today. Okay, shall I bring this up? Oh. So the other thing, while we're waiting, I've just realized that in this whole configuration, either I squint at my notes or I wear glasses that fog up through my mask. So it's one or the other. I'm electing to squint, but it may come to me like relying on the glasses. I know. Thank you for coming. Wait, do you have a landscape program here?
Yes, it's in the School of Agriculture.
Oh, okay, okay.
We have one landscape architecture. Thank you for coming. How about others of you? Are there any other folks from other? Yes. Environmental engineering. Global development. Anybody else?
No, it's not my computer. Yeah, while we're waiting, thanks for asking that too, because I think one of the things that I've tried to do, both in the actual research that I do, but also I think just in personal life, is to have more of these conversations across the field. So folks who are in planning, folks who are in architecture, and certainly in art, like where I am at UCLA, the planning school is actually in a school of the planning department is in a school of public affairs. And we share that school with public policy and social welfare. So often I feel like, I'm kind of missing some of the architecture folks, the folks who think more through design as just a way of approaching problems. And we do often get architecture, like MArch students with our masters in urban and regional planning students together. And those, I think, are really beneficial because it makes clear how some of these distinctions are really real, like that we've been trained to think differently and to solve problems differently. And I think it also opens up ways that we can think across the disciplines. And now having done research on environmental planning and urban design towards environmental ends, as you'll see imminently, it's also really great to have landscape architects and folks who are involved in landscape as part of the conversation. So one of the things, Linda asked you all to think about things like case selection or site selection and things like that, or research design. One of the aspects of this that I think, my work that I think has been interesting to me is how to think about my own research focus across the different fields. So, you could say interdisciplinary, that's one way to say it, but just, I think, more a reflexive way of thinking across different ways of knowing. That's another thing that keeps me up at night.
I can't say when this is going to be resolved for sure. So if you're okay with it, should we start, or would you like to wait?
Like with no slides?
I have asked for at least a backup
Yeah.
if this projector will not work, so that we will have something.
It will be, I can start and then it will be awkward when I get to a point where I'm like, you gotta look at this, and you're like, it's like, yeah, it's really good.
All right, then let's wait.
Okay.
How about, as we wait, I'll open up the floor and be provocative. I read about this in another place. If you can ask Kian any question, what would you like to ask? You know nothing
Wow.
about her, but you can.
That is indeed provocative. Okay, but I'm up for it.
All right, let's start with a friendly audience member, Noah.
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you moved from a background in architecture to being primarily focused on climate change and built environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're basically starting with some Q&A, and then we'll go, which is totally great. So good question, and actually quite related to what I'll talk about. So I worked as an architect mostly in and around New York for a good decade plus. And one of the things that I realized is, having always been interested in cities, growing up in Southeast Asia, being interested in the kinds of like fragile ecologies in cities there and the contentious politics often. I was really interested in cities, and as I was designing these buildings, I was wondering, so what about the histories and the politics of the places in which, the neighborhoods in which I was actually designing the buildings. And as an architect, for those of you in architecture, those of you who may have an architecture background, you probably know if you're in architecture practice, you don't have time, and certainly no one's going to pay you to think about the urban context very much. If you are in an architecture firm, or if you're an architect who pays attention to that stuff, you do it essentially on your own time. You devote some time to understanding the urban context, but you don't, professionally speaking, you don't bill for that. That's not what you do. So I was just becoming so much more interested as I worked in different neighborhoods in New York about the histories of those places. So I wanted to do more research about that. I wanted to teach more about that. And so that brought me to PhD planning in urban planning. And honestly, I thought it would be a straightforward transition. Like architecture, urban planning's just like intertwined and related. But no, first year of the PhD program, huge shock that planners thought architects were like full of shit and like only concerned with the aesthetics of the building. I'm generalizing and simplifying a bit. And architects often thinking, oh my God, planners, you never do anything. You think, process, talk, and like nothing gets done. And where are these utopian visions that you all used to have way back in the day? So there were these like real cleavages that were just like disconcerting, really. So that really is also grounds some of the work here. Thank you.
Thank you for visiting us. Thank you for visiting us today. And I was just curious. So I understand in architecture, a lot of what you design is based around like your constraints on the project, and especially in urbanized environments, a lot of those constraints are put in place by city planners. So I guess I'm just sort of curious, like from your experience as an architect, like what are the sorts of restraints that you encounter that were put in place by regulations? And, like, which ones would you, if you had the power to, like, which ones would you change? Which ones would you, I guess, remove altogether? Which ones do you think are important?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So the question is basically about the constraints that architects face that may be more in the planning and public policy realm, right? And so which of these constraints maybe could you take on as an architect, or which of them, or I'm going to change the question up a bit and say, like, how do you deal one way or the other with that in, oh, look at that. So, you got the first applause of the day. So I'll say one thing about that, which is that architects, and I think it's a real issue that architects and let's say even like urban designers face constraints that may not be part of their choosing or may not necessarily be in their direct realm of engagement, but you still have to, your problem approach or your approach to solving problems still has to take that into account. One thing, and then we can start. Andrea Kahn, who is an architect, has an interesting chapter in a book called, I think the book is called Site Matters. I can't remember what the chapter is called, where she talks about how an urban site for architects is a very particular kind of problem. And so she situates the project of architecture within the interconnected flows of urban spaces. So I would definitely recommend that chapter by Andrea Kahn on, I believe it may well be called something like urban sites, but it is about the practice of designing within the interconnected flows of urban spaces. So here we go. So let's start this for real, and just so that we don't go way over time. So welcome. So many of us experience directly how severe weather events and long-term climate impacts challenge the way we live and work in cities. As the debates over cities planning and climate change intensify, governments are coming up with increasingly ambitious plans to respond to these climate impacts. And these plans involve extensive reconfigurations of built and natural environments and massive economic resources. They promise, quote, ecological security, that is safety from climate impacts, and the promise of the perpetuation of capitalist growth. And yet they raise really intractable problems, including divisions about how and what to protect on sites that are already home to marginalized urban residents. Academic research and practice in the fields, as we've been talking about, in the fields of planning, urban design, architecture, landscape architecture, engineering, public policy, all take on these problems in their own ways. But in my view, divisions in how we see and do things have blinded us to those interconnected processes that link environment, space, and socio-political contestation. So in my research, I argue for a new kind of sociospatial analysis in order to understand the ways that urban environmental projects are intertwined within dominant modes of globalized capitalist development, and the ways in which resistance and alternative visions to these dominant modes are formed and might be harnessed towards more just urban futures. So in my book, Form and Flow, The Spatial Politics of Urban Resilience and Climate Justice, I take a particular cut through these problems. I investigate sites in New York, Jakarta, and Rotterdam, and look through the lens of what I call a political ecology of design to expose the politics and the social relations of urban climate change responses. And my research details the power relationships and the conflicts around these responses. It traces the global flows and of ideas and influence in the production of climate change plans, and also the local social movements organized against unjust and exclusionary actions. So in my talk today, I'll give some context to the whole, and then focus on two key threads before presenting some important takeaways. And then I'll leave maybe some questions about the future for discussion. So first, some context. In October 2012, about 9 years ago, Hurricane Sandy hit the New York region. The storm made vivid the vulnerability of the metropolitan region to increasing climate change impacts. And in the wake of the storm, attention focused on Rebuild by Design, a competition led by the US Housing and Urban Development Department, and funded in large part by the Rockefeller Foundation. Its objective is to find innovative design and funding mechanisms to protect the city from stronger storms and sea level rise. On the left, you see one project by the team led by architecture firm BIG for what they call a big U around the southern tip of Manhattan. And at the same time, Hurricane Sandy exposed the unequal impacts of disaster and recovery, what researchers have called a tale of two Sandys. And so operations, these kinds of grassroots recovery operations by organizations like Occupy Sandy have been well noted. So people have talked about them, but so far they haven't had a lot of impact on planning and policy making more institutionally. In January 2013, just a few weeks after, a couple of months after that, halfway around the world, massive floods again hit Jakarta, Indonesia. And the floods called into question the predicament of the city, considered one of the most vulnerable to climate change, with its failing infrastructure made more acute by serious social inequalities in the city. So in response to this round of most recent floods in 2013, city officials, backed by international consultants, proposed what they call the Giant Seawall Master Plan. It is in itself a city for 1.5 million people to be built on reclaimed land in the Jakarta Bay. So reclaiming land, building a whole new city. From the air, it is shaped like the great Garuda, which is a mythical eagle that is the national symbol for Indonesia. And so this master plan on your left comes alongside continual efforts to evict residents living in the informal kampung settlements, such as this Kampung Pulau on the right, that typically house the poorest urban residents in oftentimes some of the riskiest places along riverbanks and coastal areas. Some of the kampung residents have fought back against eviction as usual, organizing and coming up with counterplans, with alternative visions of how they would prefer their kampungs to look. So New York and Jakarta are very distinct and different cities, and these events might be considered isolated, linked only by timing and too much water. But in some specific ways, they occurred not only in parallel, but in relation to each other. The disasters prompted big plans in both cities, so these ambitious plans that would bring them to an entirely different urban future. And they also, the events exposed the persistent social and spatial inequalities in both cities. Long-term patterns of marginalization that were accentuated in the wake of the disasters and at risk of being entrenched by the proposed plans. In both cities, community groups on the ground mobilized against and in response to what they perceive as the inequities of the plans. So these cities were caught up in intersecting moments, transformative environmental and political change on global and local scales, and shifting ideas about the present and future of cities. In my book, I explore how in their interconnections with another city, Rotterdam, they reveal the emerging dynamics of global and urban environmental struggles. So, on the one hand, a new wave of large-scale urban interventions around climate change, driven by environmental urgency, urban development pressures, and global networks of expertise, mobilized towards new modes of capitalist accumulation in the face of environmental catastrophe. and on the other, social movements rising in response to historical and present injustice, often harnessing for themselves the tools and strategies of professionalized planning and urban design and the power of networks. So these initiatives, what I call plans and counterplans, represent contested visions in response to social and environmental challenges with different, often oppositional priorities, methods, and objectives. So they bring to light institutional power relationships, international relations, the histories and geographies of marginalization, systemic oppressions of race and class, and the political economy of place. So really, urban spatial politics in a new context of global environmental change. New York, Jakarta, and Rotterdam are exemplary of how these new globally constituted and locally contested urban responses are developing. But they represent, in my view, an increasingly general condition, the interconnected social, spatial, and environmental conflicts and motivations that now affect cities all around the world. So I ask, in the face of climate change and uneven social and spatial urban development, how are contesting visions of the future proposed, produced, and how do they gain power? My research takes place in a particular context of cities and climate change. First, the emergence of urban resilience as a primary theme to discussions of climate change planning. And resilience is celebrated as a positive characteristic of people and places to, quote, bounce back from shocks and stresses. But it is also critiqued for its vagueness and the ways in which it promotes and protects status quo economic systems. Like, bounce back to what? The kinds of urban development that got us into this quandary in the first place. Second, the emergence of a global climate justice movement. This movement builds on environmental justice themes and foundations, but it also dislocates the scales and the temporalities of what used to be more place-based and locally specific notions of justice to broader global concerns and to both immediate and longer-term world historical periods. So building on environmental justice, but really taking it to the scales and temporalities of climate change. At its core, this globalizing climate justice movement gains strength from community-based struggles, whether it's fights by fisher folks or farmers or indigenous rights groups, but it is shaped through the multi-scalar and multi-level frameworks and networks, and through the actions of widely dispersed institutions and activist groups. And for me, the structures and the structures and the modes of organizing of the global climate justice movement offer some important implications for issues to do with urban space, climate change, and justice. So in the face of these emerging dynamics, scholarship on urban climate change responses, present company excluded, totally, has tended to reinforce divisions between social and spatial, drawing a line between hard engineered infrastructure and measures that are more social and political in focus. It has often assumed urban politics to be complex but contained and cohesive. So one city has a particular kind of politics, another city has another kind of politics. And it has often relied on static conceptualizations of the city as a bounded territory. So this leaves out not only the relationship between a municipal entity and the urban region, but also leaves out the interconnectedness of social and spatial relationships across networks and broader processes of urbanization. So in my research, I set out to offer a counterpoint to these dominant discourses. So this is really for the more sort of theoretically inclined folks. So I ground my research in theories that explain social and spatial power relationships in the urban, including the social production of space, urbanization and uneven development, spatial justice, and the geographies of policy mobility. And I also looked to the theories of the interrelationships among social, ecological, and technological processes in and through cities. And I can go back and talk more about this if folks are interested. So the first thread out of two, how is this new wave of planning conceptualized? Who's behind these plans and who stands to benefit? So one remarkable thing about this story, and increasingly others like it, is the role of the Dutch. Here we see on your right, then Dutch Infrastructure Minister Melanie Schultz with US HUD Secretary Sean Donovan signing a memorandum of understanding for cooperation between the Netherlands and the United States on sustainable urban development and water management. And then Minister Schultz again on your left at the announcement of the Jakarta Giant Seawall Master Plan, which was funded and authored by Dutch consultants. And some of this stuff is not that surprising. So the Netherlands has long been held as a beacon of spatial planning and water management, often epitomized by large-scale national projects such as the Delta Works that started after a large storm in 1954 and was completed in 1997. But in the last decade or so, let's say like the last 12 years or so, economic liberalization and the global economic crisis has led to initiatives to decentralize decision-making and embrace more market-driven approaches to spatial planning and development. And also in 2008, a new Delta Commission, so this was the original Delta Commission came up with the Delta Works. A new Delta Commission was formed in 2008 and charged with long-term safety against climate change impacts. And in addition to recommending things like higher protections for diked areas around the most sensitive urban areas, the Commission also recommended more flexible approaches, including Room for the River, which is a program to allow occasional localized flooding along the rivers. So instead of hardening all the dikes, letting some of them flood in some areas. So this new approach is called Building with Nature, and it's technocratic still, but also ecological. And it's viewed as a self-described paradigm shift in Dutch spatial and environmental planning. So on one level, many environmental projects are now conceived on a city or local scale in the Netherlands, not just as a national project. Rotterdam in particular has developed a really ambitious climate adaptation program. And if you just look up urban climate change adaptation, Rotterdam often just immediately comes to the fore as a model. City officials tout pilot projects including water squares, recreational spaces that can also function as a water holding tank during cloudbursts. And then on another level, so that's on one level looking inwards to the cities. On another level, there's an outward shift, a focus on international relationships. So entities such as Connecting Delta Cities, a network initiated and coordinated by the Rotterdam Climate Program, Deltares, a Dutch hydrological research institute, and the Netherlands Water Partnership, formed to help the Dutch water sector gain greater international impact, all cooperate to bring opportunity to Dutch firms for projects around the world. So at the Cities in Times of Climate Change conference in Rotterdam, and this was the second one in 2014, Dutch climate and water agencies and engineering and infrastructure firms met with delegations from the United States, from Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia, and elsewhere to talk about their work around water management. So here the interconnections between national and local government, private interests, and international constituents are made explicit. So for the Dutch, water management is a key export industry, one which they hold undeniable pedigree. And climate change has only made worse, or well, made more important the search for solutions. And the economic crisis at home in the Netherlands after 2008 has further motivated these global relationships. So a project like the giant seawall in Jakarta serves not only as a venue for the continued involvement of the Dutch in Indonesia, but also, to quote an official at the Netherlands Water Partnership, a vehicle for the Dutch sector to show their expertise, to be a credible partner, especially for private investors, a showcase project for the rest of Asian city development. So, in Jakarta, the deep involvement of the Netherlands brings up some provocative questions. The giant seawall master plan is paid for by the Dutch government, though its implementation is actually supposed to be privately funded through new leasable reclaimed land. But the primary authors of the plan are Dutch infrastructure and engineering firms, urban designers and landscape architects, and economic development officials. Minister Schultz, when she unveiled the plan, said, quote, "We Dutch feel very at home here. We feel senang, which is the Indonesian word for at ease." This in Jakarta, a city that still very much bears the social, spatial, and technological legacy of more than 3 centuries of Dutch colonization. So beyond the notion of climate-induced disaster capitalism, it is tempting to see this as an example of environmental neocolonialism. But I also think it's not that straightforward. Dutch officials talk about the struggle of proving that they should be the long-term partners when Korean and Japanese firms are offering solutions often for much less money. The international relationships cultivated by the Dutch are not only with so-called developing countries. Many of the firms and individuals associated with Dutch climate adaptation are also involved in Rebuild by Design in New York. So one of the principles of Rebuild by Design is a man called Henk Ovink. I believe he has actually spoken here in the past, a former Dutch director for spatial planning and water affairs. And 4 out of the 6 winning firms of Rebuild by Design have substantial Dutch expertise on them. So what's happening? So to begin a kind of more static view of the relationship between nation states and cities. What we see then is a multi-scalar, multi-level network through which the diffusion of capital, knowledge, and influence takes place. So what's notable are the ways in which national strategy, so in this case, Dutch national strategy, is operationalized through cities. Urban networks like connecting delta cities and entities such as Deltares are part of new relationships that start to pull the global and the urban together. And I think this is really important in light of prevalent discussions in planning, especially that, in my view, overstress the role of the city as a focus of solutions. So we really need to see what's going on in the cities in the context of these broader relationships and broader events. The rhetoric and the reality of climate urgency opens new avenues of exchange, and these networks and entities play crucial roles in bridging scales and political boundaries. So, thread number 2, what happens when globally constituted plans hit the ground in particular places? So this Jakarta Giant Seawall Plan is pretty ingenious. Flooding in Jakarta comes from 2 places, both from the sea and from the rivers, the 13 rivers that flow through the urban region, especially when it rains heavily. The city itself is sinking rapidly due to land subsidence caused primarily by groundwater overpumping. And in fact, the city is sinking way faster than sea levels are rising. Clogged canals and rivers and decreased land permeability all contribute to the drainage issues. And so how it's supposed to work is the giant seawall, I think there's probably a pointer, the giant seawall encloses these 2 big retention lakes and enables these lakes to be pumped low enough so that existing canals and rivers in the city itself can flow into it. And so this plan, you know, when you read about it, it's often called the sea level rise plan, but really it's a sinking city plan. Besides the kind of the engineering aspect, it is also a project for which the symbolic and formal nature of the project is particularly important and rivals the actual infrastructural ambitions. So renderings by Rotterdam-based urban design and landscape architecture firm Kuiper Companions depict this new seawall city as a bright white and green bird landing and protecting the existing city behind it. References to a winged Brasilia in Brazil and the feeling that this is a kind of happier, softer version of utopian modernism are hard to shake. The renderings represent a kind of idealized society living through the impacts of climate change with prosperity, recreation, and lots of urban nature on the other side. Discussions of this great Garuda project are quite revealing. Here's a sketch by the landscape architect. Design for engineers and hydrologists often come after the engineering, after key decisions are made. But the designer himself speaks of covering his hotel room in Jakarta with paper and going at it freehand, and a kind of like rock star movement of landscape architecture. But still, you know, it's not that anymore. So part of the point is that people have learned. That's what I found out. So the designer Van den Bomen emphasizes the necessity of local stakeholders in Indonesia to embrace this giant seawall plan. So for him, it is critical for it to be an Indonesian project. So he says, quote, our role was to capture the technical processes and integrally shape them in a way such that the people of Jakarta, our counterparts in the process, could become enthusiastic about the initiative. So the form of it, this pretty, straightforward and one could say like simplistic invocation of the Great Garuda is a way to make it an Indonesian project. And did it work? Maybe a little bit. So Dutch Deltaris hydrologist Kees Bons says the Great Garuda turned, quote, a Dutch development aid project into national ambition. But design is also part of the counterplans against these dominating visions. So Jakarta residents most vulnerable to the floods are, as I said before, the residents of these informal kampung settlements, especially along the notorious Ciliwung River. City leaders blame the kampung residents for the floods, saying that they throw garbage into the rivers and clog it up, while generally neglecting or ignoring large-scale dumping by other folks, and also pretty rampant urban development, rampant and uncontrolled urban development. And the giant seawall plan, which relies on clean rivers flowing into those retention ponds, promises to, or places renewed urgency on projects by the World Bank and Japanese Development Agency, JICA, to dredge and clean these rivers, which will further displace people, the kampung residents living on the edge. Coalitions of kampung residents have continued to resist eviction. So on your right, you see UPC, the Urban Poor Consortium in the Muara Baru area of North Jakarta. On their left, Ciliwung Merdeka, organizing residents from Bukit Duri and Kampung Pulo along the Ciliwung. They've built coalitions that include researchers, lawyers, community architects, and students. They forged working agreements with then Jakarta Governor Jokowi for a new, more socially responsible and socially attuned housing scheme, as well as rehousing within the area for those residents who do have to be, who are evicted. So Ciliwung Merdeka's quote, humanitarian vertical kampung proposal, for what they did for this was they conducted their own community mapping project and came up with their own design to widen the river, save key landmarks, and reconfigure part of the kampung using a stacked higher density kampung house model. So this would allow residents to remain in place and maintain livelihoods and social networks. For these alternate visions, these counterplans, organizers build on real shared struggles, conditions of notoriety in the kampungs, a history of political activism, and the vision and ability to form new coalitions. And so design here becomes part of a platform for political organizing. It makes the political visions tangible with documents, drawings, things that planners and policymakers might understand to explain and negotiate. So says Ciliwung Merdeka activist Sandiawan Sumardi, quote, we proved that a collective planning process with plans and mappings could be made by the community themselves in ways that were concrete. So in Jakarta, these counterplans operate across geographic scales. First, at the site of the dredging projects sorry, let me back up for a bit. First, at the scale of the immediate site, where floods and river dredging projects threaten the settlements. Second, also in the relationships between the dredging projects and broader rules and regulations. So activists compile and disseminate national laws on dredging, reclamation, and landfilling, which expands the territory of that political organizing. So it's not just at the site of where the dredging is happening itself. They make the point that these are part of the broader rules and regulations of the city. And third, on a regional scale, the Urban Poor Consortium, UPC, has developed a network movement across a number of Indonesian cities confronting a diverse set of threats. And the strategies for the counterplans also operate through networks. So UPC, on one level, functions as a network of local organizers across a set of Indonesian cities. On another level, it forms networks across disciplines with architects and academic academic researchers. And through its relationship with Rujak, an urban advocacy organization, it links to an extensive network of Indonesian and international scholars and activists. And this kind of counter network presents a new way of thinking of reflexive modes of resistance to hegemonic systems. So I'll offer hopefully a quick parallel narrative about New York. So Rebuild by Design was indeed quite innovative. We should remind ourselves that this kind of thing, a design for climate change as part of a federally focused initiative, is not something we see every day. And we would love to see more, honestly, right? And this happened partly through the timing and fortuitous connections of powerful people, including then HUD Secretary Sean Donovan, Rockefeller Foundation President Judith Rodin, and the aforementioned Henk Oving. So important people coming together saying, this is what we should do. So we see here, on the left here, an image by landscape architecture firm Scape, to build breakwaters off the coast of Staten Island using oysters, so a kind of living breakwater. So this is really New York's version of that idealized post-climate future. According to Henk Oving, the principle of Rebuild by Design, the initiative attempted to bridge two cultures, to merge competition with collaboration and to find the common. And this is a really ambitious task in the urban spatial politics of a city like New York. The Rebuild by Design award, the whole process was set up in a very specific way, with community development block grants for disaster recovery assigned to local municipalities specifically meant for low-income communities. Teams had to win the backing of constituents on the ground in order to win the Rebuild by Design awards. And this actually resulted in more communicative design processes than we would ordinarily see or expect. And this is aligned with a lot of things that we learn and read about in terms of community engaged planning. So in the Big U proposal for Lower Manhattan, designers attempted to hybridize Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs, so the devil and angel of planning, respectively, and so to mesh top-down and bottom-up large-scale infrastructure and community relationships together. And community stakeholders were quite happy with the vision and the participation, and they helped convince officials to embrace the big plan. After the competition, each locality then assumed control of the individual projects. And early on in the implementation phase, after the competition, we already saw conflicts over which areas are protected first and how. So community members in the lower income areas of the Lower East Side in Manhattan, the very ones who helped bring the officials on board, contended that they were not being prioritized, even though their neighborhoods were the hardest hit by the storm. And these conflicts continue to today, even though the project has shifted and turned into a somewhat different thing, but there are still ongoing protests against the phasing of the plan, the kind of plan that they are putting up, even as the project has broken ground and is under construction. So here, design works to engage communities and to win the award and to capture imaginations, really. But it's limited by an inability to change social relationships and political structures. So is there an alternative? I'll just mention one that I've personally been involved with. So as we said earlier, prior to my PhD, I designed a community center for the Red Hook Initiative in Red Hook, New York, in Red Hook, Brooklyn, an organization that works with youth who live in public housing, in the Red Hook houses. The RHI space here was designed in a collaborative process by and for the community, and we made a collective sense of ownership a priority. So when Sandy hit, Red Hook, low-lying and coastal was particularly hard hit, and I was especially worried about what would happen to the staff members and their constituents here. But the RHI space survived the storm pretty unscathed, and in the days following, Red Hook emerged as a hub of grassroots recovery efforts. Staff from RHI took the lead and worked with organizers from Occupy Sandy and other volunteers and city and national agencies to set up a recovery center and soup kitchen in the RHI building. RHI's community Wi-Fi network was used by FEMA to jumpstart their own emergency communications network. So in Red Hook, community building, social and environmental resilience, and space and design were inextricably interlinked. And to me, it serves as an example of how designers can engage with deeper aspects of justice and equity. We certainly didn't know that a storm would hit, but what mattered was the groundwork was laid, in this case, mostly by the RHI staff who worked with their constituents well before the storm to create these resilient social networks. But also in the process of design, which was aligned and in tune with the organization's own theory of change. So it's not that one project changes that much, but I would say that this one project was successfully embedded in a broader process for organizing for social and political change. So let me just check the time here. So I've gone on a little bit longer than I thought. I'm gonna skip past this very texty slide here and say I want to bring up two things before I end, two takeaways from the research. So going back to my initial framing of this talk in the book, a key driver is to challenge prevailing ideas about cities, planning, and climate change. So I want to, through the book, reframe two critical issues. One is that I would like to insist that urban adaptation must be simultaneously social and spatial. So what I did at the end of the book is develop a set of typologies for urban adaptation that focus on the level of cohesion of both the social organization and the spatial form of the strategies, both together. So from, let's say, type 0, the default condition, a city confronts climate change impacts and does nothing. That's type 0. To type 1, possibly the preferred condition, where there's a cohesive organization of cohesive, comprehensive protections. So cohesion both on social and spatial levels. To various different configurations of cohesion and fragmentation, understanding that it's not always feasible and possible or even desirable, really, for such comprehensive planning and protections. We can talk about this a little bit more, but what I'm trying to do is to make the point that we don't all need to idealize a Dutch national and urban development model. That is one way to think about social and spatial protections. We can think about other ways where people like the Red Hook Initiative or activists in the Jakarta kampungs struggle within their own context to create protections for themselves. And this may not be enough, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but it gives us models to say what's different about these places, what can organizers, designers, and planners aspire to, and who do they have to work with in order to build towards the model that they want. So I know there's a lot here that I didn't talk about, but I want to bring up the second reframing. A second reframing concerns what I noted as the problematic nature of resilience. Can we imagine a more just resilience? Recall how RHI, the Red Hook Initiative, was able to respond effectively to the chaos of Hurricane Sandy. Jill Eisenhardt, RHI director, describes how important lessons were instilled among their youth constituents well before the storm hit. So, quote, before October 2012, we talked about resilience every day, and our definition of it was, life will inevitably knock you down. You need to be able to get back up again. Resilience is is having the skills to know, no glasses. Resilience is being able to know that you have the strength or knowledge or self-belief or motivation or confidence within yourself to get up and try again. And that you have a social support network around you that's going to help you when you can't do it for yourself. So in other words, individual resilience in the face of systematic challenges is important, but more importantly, individuals are part of a collective similarly invested in survival and flourishing, developed through a history of shared struggle. This is a political notion of resilience, born of a distinct theory and practice of change. So further, Eisenhardt emphasizes the place-based and ground-up nature of such resilience. She explains, speaking of her constituents who are largely public housing residents, quote, a lot of what we're responding to is directly related to the systems and forces and circumstances that are true in this neighborhood. Here, everyone has the same experience with transportation or how long it takes to get anywhere. Everyone has the same experience with the fact that there is no public high school here. Everyone has the same experience that all of that open ball field space is closed and there's nowhere to go. So Jill Eisenhardt emphasizes the social experiences and structural forces of a specific geographic boundary and spatial condition. Her words make clear the importance of recognizing social relationships that form as part of, and sometimes in spite of, public institutional systems and places. Resilience here is always positional. It is grounded in the historical social relationships emerging from shared struggle against systemic oppression. But it is also grounded in the physical spaces, the literal grounds from which such struggle emerges. And I think this is where planners who often are involved in creating public structures, public institutions in cities, can take a lot of lessons. Such ideas about place-specific, spatially meaningful justice and resilience can prompt us to think about our next, what is it to think about, let's say, a new social housing program, when previous efforts at public housing have both marginalized people, but possibly also in the Red Hook case, enabled a kind of awareness and organization based on shared struggle and that collective belonging. I think it's not to paint the role of the state with rose-tinted glasses, I'm not saying like public housing will immediately solve everything, but we need to note how planning possibilities such as more attention to social housing can be part of how organizations such as the Red Hook Initiative conceive of their own building of resilience from the ground up. So I will stop there and leave some stuff for later. Thank you. Should we sit or should we just walk around?
I was going to suggest that we just stand,
Okay.
in part because I'm going to only ask one of my many questions that I envision, because we're running towards
late.
2:20, which is, and I know that our students are full of questions, so I don't want to take over the time, because I get to see you later as well. So thank you so much for that really brilliant encapsulation of your book. And I should note that there are copies of just five copies here of Kian's book. If you would like to take one home and she can sign it for you, you can come up later and purchase one. So I think this is, since I'm teaching history this year, the more that I teach history, the more I'm struck by the circularity of time. And so much of what you've said here today, I could think of in colonial times a similar type of process, not without saying that this is neocolonialism, but the way that the Dutch or the British, they landed in these port cities, and the touch of what they landed on was always in the earlier phases of colonialism, like a site or specific purpose, at that time for extraction or trade, now perhaps more of a solicitous nature, given the change in power dynamics, but that there was always an indigenous response that was of this kind of community nature that resisted, that challenge, that had counter plans, and that always has never been fully ever attended to. And so now we see this, it's like the same old stuff all over again, but just in a different language, a different technology, and a different kind of condition that we're responding to. But that what has changed is the rise of a nation state. And that what is interesting is that in these instances where the Dutch are landing and they have these particular points where they touch, there is an interlocutor, which is chiefly the national government, that is bridging between the domestic politics and the international ideas. What you write about in another, your Eiger article, which is not talked about here, you explore how the Dutch the Jakarta flooding is really not only the kind of geography we zoom in on for the Great Garuda, but it's part of the greater region of Jakarta that's been developed, and what developers are doing and what the government is doing with water intake pipes and how they have changed the entire hydrology of that system. And that system at that scale, which also is really important, has no unified set of environmental organizations or community organizations to produce any kind of power. So I'm struck really by what is it that we expect from the state, especially in your 4 diagrams or the 5 diagrams that you show at the end, that there is a kind of selectiveness drawn from the cases that you have, in part because of the design nature, but there's like middle class developments that are neither protected by this nor affected by the counter plans. What about them? And there's these broader geographies where there are no environment or no community organizations as well. And so in the diagrams themselves, there's like the strong state, and then there's like the weak state, and then there's like NGOs. Is there a time when they actually come together? Is there a space here for a strong state and a strong civil society sector that could perhaps change the dynamic of what has been going on for decades, where they are talking past or talking in contrast to each other, but never really together in a supportive, collaborative way?
Yeah, that is a central and excellent question. So I'll say a few things about. The first thing I'll say is, it is, in some ways, like, it's frustrating to me because no matter how much I try to tell the story here and frame the context and tell the story, it still ends up oftentimes seeming like there's a strong state, and then there are community organizations who are valiantly like fighting against perceived injustice. And then me, in some ways, like caught in the middle, but as you know, you suggested actually last night over dinner, like with my heart with the community organizations. And so like, how do we bring these two things together? And no matter how much I try to like rehearse the story, like I end up, I think, maybe overstating the top-down and bottom-up nature of this. Because one of the things I do want to emphasize in the book is that, you know, that is not the full story, because on the one hand, the folks who are involved in the dominant plans are increasingly recognizing that they at least have to make appeals to folks who are doing this community organizing on the ground. So like Henk Oving will stand in, you know, a room like this one, or in Rotterdam somewhere giving a presentation, and he'll talk about, you know, I do this because of this woman, Damaris Reyes, the woman from the good old Lower East Side, who is a housing justice and community organizer in the Lower East Side, and pointing out how Damaris Reyes' work inspires him to keep on doing what he does. And so this is, you know, Hank saying that, you know, I've learned from taking part in this Rebuild by Design effort. You know, as a Dutch spatial planner who's used to a totally different context, here's some place where community organizers on the ground have a lot to contribute. That is just one way where there is learning across levels on the ground. The point about it's UPC, UPC in the Indonesian language, how UPC organizers and a group like Ruja continually maintains relationships with international researchers like me, like inviting me in to understand what's going on, because of a recognition that simply like keeping on chipping away on the local level is not enough often, and that they need to garner more power. Some of that power comes from coalition building with more institutionalized, or people with more institutional power, like lawyers who are able to launch legal challenges to the evictions, and as well community architects that I showed, and knowledge producers, understanding that the more that they get this broad-based coalition, the more power they actually have. So I don't think it's only like little movements, but I do think it's not enough. And so that's one part of the response. The other part is, you know, the type 1, so what I'm proposing as the idealized Dutch model, it's not always even the Dutch model. When you dig under the surface and you talk to folks involved in Dutch planning, you know, there are tensions, there are cracks in the system. There are, in the same ways that one might find in other places, but what they do have, which is not available in New York or Jakarta or elsewhere, is 800 years of learning to be in this particular system where spatial planning and water management and social life has developed together. And those 800 years cannot be, like, when we talk about the strong state, that strong state only happens because of 800 years of social learning. And so the appeal, I think, for planners and city officials in places like New York and Jakarta is that it is not just like embrace a strong state effort, but that a top-down effort, which is necessary because climate change is too fast for us to just say, let's hope for small-scale change everywhere. I think we need change from all different directions. It's an appeal for a more comprehensive, and I don't want to say top-down, I think it's the wrong phrase for it, a more comprehensive state-led process that doesn't just note or point to, oh, these communities that we want to you know, engage with, but actually looks to those the movements for change, like the theories of change that they actually bring to the table that we haven't. I think we talk to as playing like a kind of like institutional planning role. We encourage community participation, but we don't actually include, I think, those theories of change in our plans. And I think, in fact, I think you, in your Progressive Cities article, you're pointing to some of these same dynamics, I think, where there's sometimes a tension between folks who want to do better, who are largely compliant with the status quo workings of the state, with more radical forces on the ground who are clamoring for transformation, like social transformation. And I think that's still where the struggle is, but I think that's where the struggle is worth it. So like when we teach planners, we're not just saying like, here's some struggle, we're like, how are you taking part in this system? Are you ignoring the fact that there are people clamoring for social change, or do your plans not only make room, but embrace these systemic changes at their core? And so I think that's what we would like.
Thank you. All right, I'd like to invite you guys to raise your questions.
Hi.
Hi, my name is Amira, and I'm actually from Jakarta, and the video one you showed was where my school was located, so I know
Yeah, I think that is the central, you pointed out the central struggle for the giant seawall. So a few things. One is, there are other aspects to environmental planning in Jakarta that I don't touch on in this talk, but it's a little bit in the book, where, there are things that the city ought to do to stop the sinking that they are not quite doing enough of, right? One is to make sure that municipal water delivery is more present and more equitable so that people are not pumping groundwater. And the pumping of groundwater happens whether one is poor or rich in Jakarta. It's just like many people do it, and it's contributing to the subsidence. Not a lot, like, you're not going to be able to stop big changes on the coast by meaning that people will be underwater without stopping the subsidence. So there are other aspects of environmental planning that can be done and can be more just and more equitable that doesn't rely on the outcomes of a privately funded giant seawall. The other thing is, what I've seen, and you possibly know even more about this, what I've seen is that the organizing efforts in places like Bukit Duri are partially effective in that they don't always stop the evictions, right? So some of these photos that I showed here are no longer there because there was a large-scale eviction in 2015, basically at the tail end of my research. So I saw it before. We go back now, you see basically like demolished houses that are still there a few years after the fact. So they're not always successful, but what they do is create a movement that may have successes in other places. So there's another kampung, another informal settlement called Kampung Aquarium, which was evicted and demolished. And as part of the activists organizing on the ground, they were able to convince city officials to build new housing in the neighborhood, so more or less rehousing in place for people who have been evicted and from their nearby kampungs. And these housing projects were actually done in consultation with community organizers who have been such as those from UPC, the Urban Poor Consortium, who have been organizing for this change for years. And so that hints at some progress in rehousing people who have had to vacate their kampungs. The part about, I think, more tricky, and this is like not just a Jakarta problem, the threats to fisheries and to the fisher folks, you need, I mean, this is where we can, I think, appeal to some conversations in environmental planning and coastal adaptation. We actually could use more attention to mangroves and to existing ecological spaces around Jakarta, and make sure that, or at least acknowledge that a seawall is not going to help existing mangroves, and that mangroves have been part of the coastal ecosystem for a long time. So the top line here is that if you enclose this, you're killing off the mangroves, you're killing off the fisheries. Let's find another way to do this. I think that is actually a really significant and tricky issue. But I note the challenge there, but I would point to also the successful stories where maybe one effort fails, but the movement is, but the activists managed to grow the broader movement.
So sometimes, you know how countries or cities, and when I say that the government are often their own enemies because they don't, and you mentioned that, you know, how sometimes the local communities, they have the status quo, like, you know, nobody questions what's going on in terms of climate change. Like, we're just managing, floods happen every year, and it goes on and on. So my question is, do we need, like, say for example, Dutch to come in and sort of like, you know, bring out these large-scale projects in order for the, you know, local communities to start thinking about it, or and I'm confused about if it's the Dutch who come in on their own, or if it's the countries themselves who invite or force those to come in and say, oh yeah, they know it better, they have better resources, and they know how to like make these changes while ignoring their own local communities who have the lived experiences, but who possibly don't have the time or the same amount of resources to think about these issues. So yeah, how do you like navigate that?
Yeah. So I would say, firstly, the response to whether they invite themselves or they're invited, I think it happens together. So certainly, part of the effort is that there's a national project on the part of the Netherlands to encourage Dutch firms to be part of these consortiums who are doing work on the ground in places like Jakarta, in places like Ho Chi Minh City, Dhaka. So there's a national Dutch effort to make sure that their firms are on the ground, and there is also folks in the local places, so the Indonesian officials who are open to these considerations, partly because they understand that something needs to be done, and if there's a plan that's going to be funded by the Dutch government, it's like, well, let's see it, let's do your plan, you're going to pay for it, you're going to tell us what's best, we're open to hearing about it. So I think it works both ways, and the Dutch officials have made it clear enough that they would be happy to be part of these efforts. So do they, you know, the question about whether let's say city or national officials are listening to their own people, in different places, I think it's different, but not enough generally. So one of the things that strikes me about the Jakarta project is that often it is the Dutch officials who are telling the Indonesian officials, you need to reach out to your community constituents more, because we know that this project, when it lands, when there's a master plan out, you're going to get protests. Like we've seen it before, it's not going to end well if there's no buy-in. And the Indonesian officials too often are like, we're not going to do that. Like, we don't necessarily have the participatory planning processes, and we're not necessarily invested in that. So sometimes it's interesting for someone, like if you're, you know, like you've read a lot of planning theory and you're like, oh, this is just another technocratic process. It's actually, there's a lot of learning and a lot of appeals, but there are structural hurdles to getting that work done on the ground. I think one of the things that I think is is interesting is that in both places, Jakarta and New York, you see some city officials who understand that there's actually political power in working with these community groups. In Jakarta, a couple of years now, the current mayor the current governor of the Jakarta capital city is someone who actually signed a political pact with community organizers saying that essentially, if you vote for me, I will have your interests at heart. I will stop the evictions and the demolitions. I will increase protection for informal laborers and informal workers. So he actually understood that dismissing community organizations and just like not listening to community knowledge was not the way to go. Some people, so that opens, I'm going on for a little bit, but that opens other problems because some other progressive folks are saying, oh, you're going into a political pact with this guy? Like that's, I thought you were more progressive than that. So it creates some other tensions in the movement, but it's interesting to see how community organizations have managed to influence political power, often at very high levels. Yeah, go ahead.
Professor Goh, thanks again for speaking with us today.
Absolutely.
I think this thesis you write about synthesizing the top down and the bottom up is really an interesting idea. Trying to make sure that that seems like a good way to get all parties involved. I'm curious though. I understand Indonesia is one country where they're currently considering relocating their capital outside Jakarta to Borneo. That's by no means a unique phenomenon. A lot of other countries are doing similar things. But I'm curious. Jakarta. Do you think Jakarta part of the reason Jakarta gets international is more likely to receive? Do you think Jakarta is more likely to receive international attention and international assistance by virtue of its status as Indonesia's capital? And if these plans to relocate the capital go through, which might be big if I'm not familiar with Indonesian politics, do you think that the loss of political capital that comes with the relocation of the political center would mean that Jakarta is less likely to secure these sorts of projects?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question. So what you're referring to is the plans by the current president of Indonesia, Jokowi, who was actually governor of Jakarta just a few years ago before he became president, deciding and announcing this move of the national capital to a brand new city on the island of Borneo. So totally different, another of Jakarta's really large islands. And so, as you say, this is not necessarily like an unusual or new thing. Like many countries have built new capitals, like Brasilia is one of them. And I think what will happen in Jakarta will depend on a couple of things. One, whether moving the center of national political power, well, that's like a ring. Whether moving the center of national political power actually moves the center of economic power in Indonesia. So economic power is very heavily focused on Jakarta, urban region, and Java, the island of Java. My own sense is that Jokowi's efforts to move the capital, on the one hand, is a way to better distribute the economic power and the political power, because often one follows the other. But it's also a way to claim more political power in a kind of archipelago system, like this vast sprawling Indonesian archipelago, where they have a lot of trouble actually hanging on to political power in the further reaches. Like so I think there's a clear effort, I think, for Jokowi to try to claim a more cohesive national whole, like political power. Jakarta is so much the center of the economic center of Indonesia right now, that it's going to take a lot to disrupt that and to shift it to what is now basically, palm oil plantations and rainforests. So I think that it still remains a question for me. When you look at places like Brazil moving their capital to Brasilia, it did not necessarily change the national economic balance. So like Sao Paulo is still basically like the economic engine of Brazil. I think chances are it's not going to change for a long time to come. And Jakarta's problems are way more present, like in the next 2 to 3 decades, maximum really. And so I think there's still going to be a lot of attention on Jakarta. And there's a lot of wealth embedded there right now, and that's not going to change that soon.
Okay, hi, thanks for the presentation. Well, it's interesting, like when Dr. Shai talked about circulation history, and from your presentation, I can see that on like the previous like reason for the colonizers to justify their displacement of this informal community, like the notion of race or activism. The notion of climate change is to your presentation, is more like a real problem existing, right? It's like you can use like knowledge to justify a certain kind of placement or construction. So we can see from your presentation, like the Indonesia government like they look for like Dutch companies like to seek for a more advanced way to like solve the problem and to justify their construction. And we also see like instead of we usually imagine like the local protest against like the big brother or stuff like that. Local communities in Jakarta also like seeks for international help, like from scholars like you or international NGOs. Well, it occurs to me like this kind of phenomenon, like the jump scale described by jump scale described by Mario, right? So my question is like, how do you predict the scholars like you or the supranations power, like international NGOs, influence on this kind of community? And do you like consider it like another form of colonialism?
Yeah, excellent question. So am I part of a kind of like Western global knowledge production neo-colonial model of like being like landing in Jakarta and being part of this? Yes. So yes, to the extent that, look, I think academic research is still really uneven and power-ridden, like global development. So I think it is not unusual, I think, or it's not surprising that I was able to get access in Jakarta. Part of it is like I appeal to my Southeast Asian side as well. I'm like, I'm from here. But really, they're like, yeah, maybe, but you're also, like at that point, like an MIT PhD student or like a UCLA professor. And we know you have resources and we know you have some reach. I think that is a really good concern. I think one way to answer that, I think there are a couple of different aspects to this. One way to answer that is, I think the community organizers are quite aware of this. And I think part of it is a strategy to garner and to build a broader coalition. And so they're on board with that, with full acknowledgement that it's not, that we don't come with, me being there does not disrupt power in and of itself. That's just not the case. The other aspect to this, which I think is worth being concerned about for sure, is that in places like Jakarta, the local NGO landscape is also class-based in a way that some of our own in the US nonprofit industrial complex is. So oftentimes the people who end up leading some of the organizations on the ground in Jakarta, they're grounded, but they're led by middle-class folks with some resources, and oftentimes with academic backgrounds from Western institutions. And they point to sometimes the difficulty for them to really engage and bring on board working class folks on the ground who are really taking on the bulk of the struggles. And so building their own organizations and trying to do what we also, or many of us say we want to do, which is the co-production of knowledge, is a challenge even for local organizers in Jakarta, because they have to work through their own, the power imbalances with, among the groups that they want to work with. And I think what that brings up certainly for me, is when we, firstly, not to just like pay lip service to the co-production of knowledge, but to acknowledge that the struggles, the challenges to co-production of knowledge are deep, and they're not just a global north, global south thing, or Western academic institution or NGO and Southeast Asian in this case, but even within these Southeast Asian cities, highly class-based and unfair. So points well taken.
If you're interested in a PhD, you can probe her on. If you're interested in applying for a UCLA PhD, you should definitely talk to her.
Wow.
If you're interested in Indonesia, she also does queer theory, which we have not talked about at all today. So if those are of interest to you, I believe 2:11 has been reserved between now and 4 o'clock for people who want to stop by and chat. But again, if you are interested in coming as well, please come down. So please join me in giving Dr. Goh a warm
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Cornell AAP. Yeah, I have 5 books. I'm, trying to like embody this, like I just wrote a book and now I should try to sell some mentality. They're $25, not $35.
Oh, 25.
And if you want, I will even like write my name in it.
Yeah.
But no pressure. Thank you. Oh, I should take this off. It's like all the side conversations.